Hello and welcome to today's episode of Served by SHFM, your food service hospitality podcast. The Society for Hospitality and Food Service Management is the only association focused on workplace hospitality and amenities in the food service industry. Hello and welcome back to Served by SHFM, your food service hospitality podcast. I'm your host, Michael Moore. And in today's episode, we're exploring scientific breakthroughs, specifically one, but I really want to look at how they can impact our industry. And we are joined by one of the most important people behind them. And to that point, I am just excited. I'm excited because we've never had someone like this on our podcast before, but we are joined by Hal Alper, a professor of chemical engineering, a scientist. There's about 15 different accolades in there that I'm missing, but you're at the University of Texas, Austin. Hal, thank you for spending some time with us today. Thank you for jumping in. And before we really dive in, I have to know, you have many titles, and I think you wear a lot of hats where you are. When someone asks you what you do, what do you tell them?
So I really say I'm an engineer, right? And that's the viewpoint that I have. We look at ways to solve problems. It's an engineering approach. We look in our lab, in our research, we look for biology as a way to solve those problems, but we really look at the grand problems that we have in life and try to find ways to solve them. And that's really an engineering viewpoint, if you will.
I didn't think about that. I mean, it makes sense though. In everything you do, you're trying to overcome obstacles. You're trying to find ways to work around, over and through. I mean,
trying to optimize processes, trying to find unique solutions, trying to see what's wrong in current processes. So it's really that engineer's mindset that has that global view.
I mean, in my mind, I've always called you Hal the scientist. I think I have to update it, Hal the engineer.
Well, I think it's just another one of the multiple hats, right? Yeah. To be a good engineer, you also need to know a lot about the science. So you need to have the local and the global view.
All right. So, I said this is one of our more interesting, I think, interviews and topics because we are so outside the realm of who we usually have on the show. We have, very dynamic, influential, driven people in the food service and hospitality industry, but we are way outside that today. But you have a background that kind of lines up with so many interviews we've done before in that it is unique and it's interesting to see how it shaped your career. So maybe why don't we go back before it all started, when you were young? Did you know you wanted to be a scientist and engineer when you were young?
So I knew I had an interest in various different topics. I didn't know really what an engineer fully did or was. Not too much about a scientist either, but kind of absorbed a lot of things around. So I kind of loved to watch the Weather Channel. So at one point in time, wanted to be a meteorologist. I really enjoyed kind of learning about science and math and things like that in classes as I was going through elementary school. And I grew up outside of Baltimore. And at that point in time, there was an influential neuroscience kind of surgeon kind of thinking about how to kind of work on the brain and do neurosurgery in terms of Ben Carson. And that was kind of inspiring, thinking about the idea of maybe wanting to go into medicine and wanted to go into neurosurgery. Then kind of came to the realization that I really don't like dealing with blood too much, and that probably wouldn't be a great career choice at that point in time.
It is a deterrent in that field.
Yes, you would deal with that on a day-to-day basis. So kind of step back from that, but kind of recognizing that I really enjoyed the types of ideas of science, the ideas of thinking about problems. And that's kind of, again, that merger of science and engineering there. And really at that point in time, kind of as we kind of talk to guidance counselors before the internet, if you will, right? To kind of get advice, and was kind of pushed into this idea of looking at the things I really enjoyed. I enjoyed chemistry. I enjoyed math. And they're saying, well, there's a great major that brings those two things together. It's called chemical engineering. And so sure enough, I applied to a program for chemical engineering, not really knowing too much about it or what it was going to be or what doors it would open up, but really just the idea that it may bring things together that I enjoy doing.
And so what is chemical engineering? Can you kind of layman's terms, because I'm a foot apart from the industry. I think everybody else that's probably listening is. So, what is chemical engineering when you break it down?
Yeah, so I think the best way to describe it is chemical engineering really takes processes that you can kind of really discoveries, if you will, processes or discoveries that you have at the bench scale and brings it to reality. So early on in the field, a lot of it was revolving around petroleum resources. So taking the ideas of doing small chemistry at the bench scale and then being able to scale that up to a large scale refinery to make all of our oils and chemicals. And as time goes on, that has also broadened in scope to look at how to scale up microelectronic processes, how to make nanomaterials, how to make electrical type systems. And then more recently, how to take the discovery of what we can do with biology and scale that up to larger processes. And this has gone to making therapeutic protein. So the process of producing insulin, as an example, has been brought forth with a lot of chemical engineering principles. The ability to make biofuel, so corn ethanol, things of that nature, is really a bioprocess that has been pushed forth with chemical engineers. And more recently, how to be able to import kind of methods of called synthetic biology to rewire genetic systems.
So would it be safe to say it's kind of along the lines of taking a proven theory and moving it into the world of practical application?
Absolutely.
Okay, I could wrap my tiny brain around that a little bit. So did you have was this in your family, or was it simply conversations with your guidance counselor?
A lot of it was just chance interactions in that regard, kind of just associating with people, hearing kind of ideas in that regard. So yeah, you enjoy this, you enjoy that. Let's bring these types of things together. I mean, you use the word chemical engineering. Usually it's not a great conversation starter. It usually ends most conversations to some extent, right? People, it goes one of two ways. People ask, oh, what do you do? I say, well, I'm a chemical engineer. And they're, oh, or the other approach was, oh, I hated chemistry when I was in college, right? So it goes in one of those two different directions, usually for most conversations. Every now and then you'll meet someone who is like, oh, I know someone who's a chemical engineer, or my parents are a chemical engineer. But more than likely, it'll kind of come up against this idea that it's this really archaic thing that no one really knows what it is. But in reality, it's the idea of solving problems with the understanding of chemical principles behind it. And that gets basic chemistry, or it can be biochemistry. And that kind of really merges together a lot of the topics I was interested in, which is what kind of got me applying to that when I went to college. But still, even when I started there, didn't really fully know and recognize and understand what that could actually do in the future.
So, I mean, how'd you make that leap? So you're in high school, you have these conversations, you figured out that, this maybe is the direction you want to go, not specifically, but how'd you settle on school? What came next?
Yeah, so then I applied to a number of schools, and mostly schools that were local. Since I growing up again in Baltimore, so I applied to University of Maryland, I applied to Johns Hopkins, I applied to Delaware, so places that were kind of really local to there, and ended up going to University of Maryland College Park, which actually where my father had went for his undergraduate, not in engineering sciences, and then kind of got started there at University of Maryland and went to, as everyone has to go into, some kind of orientation program. And there, the undergraduate advisor at the time said a lot about chemical engineering and said, this is really opens the door to all these great discoveries and processes, and we can create new things for the world. And I was like, whoa, that's really interesting. This is like a really big picture thing that we can do. And then he also said, take an active role in your education, right? You should go in and you should get involved in research. And so I said, all right. So following kind of what I've been told sounds like a good idea. So how do I get started there? Well, nothing other than going to the person who told you to do research is probably the best thing to do. So I then went to go talk with him and said, I'm interested in doing research and I should be doing that while doing my bachelor's degree. And he, very graciously gave me a position in his lab to start kind of exploring types of opportunities there and learning a little bit of what it's like to be in a lab.
And so at some point, I remember when we were talking, I forget exactly how you phrased it. You mentioned a lot of your decisions were not made on a whim, but almost left up to chance. Can you, what was the story that you shared originally? Was it, yeah.
Yeah. So going with that, so I worked with this professor for a while, and then moving on, I went to go to graduate school. And so I obviously listened to the advice I was given for graduate school. You should apply to MIT for graduate school. I'm like, okay, sounds like a good place to go. And so it's nonchalantly, right? And so I applied there and got in. And then people told me, oh, but if now that you get in there, you should work with this other professor there and doing this other type of work on engineering cells and metabolic engineering. And I said, okay, that sounds like a good plan, and went through. And eventually that was an area that I fell in love with and had been working on ever since. And so looking back on all that, a lot of my path really has been these chance encounters, right? Talking with people, with certain people, or hearing advice and then going down that road. And a lot of that advice, I think, was really kickstarted by my undergraduate advisor. So I just mentioned before, in terms of doing research with him. And so as I was kind of finishing up my undergraduate, I was having conversations with him in terms of how he got into chemical engineering and how he kind of went through on his path and kind of trying to get some final advice before I went off to graduate school. And so he said, well, it's an interesting story. And he kind of goes through his own personal family history, how he had just come to the United States and was unclear about what major he wanted to get into, and ended up going to a kind of a career fair, if you will, that was kind of at the beginning of the semester, and went through and collected a lot of different brochures from different possible majors, and kind of collected all that, went back to his dorm, and kind of looking at everything, contemplating what he wants to sign up for. And there was this multifaceted pencil that they had given out, one of those novelty type ones that on each of the different facets had a different major listed on it. So he was kind of looking around, playing with that pencil for a while, and then decided to flip it up in the air, and it landed face up with chemical engineering. And that's how he got into the discipline. So kind of in some respects, kind of thinking back, a lot of these chance encounters really were reliant upon the direction of wind in that room at that given day to have that pencil kind of land chemical engineering up.
I can't tell if you are the poster child for, following good advice and taking things seriously from a young age, or if you're an absolute anomaly that, it's all landed kind of face up, but you're like, well, we're going to do this.
Yeah, or
we'll
just walking completely with a naivete essentially at the beginning, right? And I think a lot of that is a little bit of a reflection of how important mentorship and interaction really is. And that's something that I take, I really take it for granted that I got lucky in terms of a lot of these chance events. And it's something that I take in a much more active role in, kind of really talking with students, both undergraduate and graduate students in my lab, in my classes, really trying to see what gives them a spark, what they're interested in, and trying to get them on a path to provide information. Because I think in some respects we're at the polar opposite of where I was. You didn't have a lot of access to here's a kids these days, right, type of opportunity discussion, right? But back in the day, we didn't have all this information, and things were just kind of populating on the internet, and it wasn't as easy to find information. So a lot of it was by having discussions and kind of looking at a role model and having some sort of path driven from that. Whereas now, I think information is so much at your fingertips that there's maybe too much information to synthesize, too many paths, too much to kind of think through. So I think this idea of having an important mentor in your life is just as important now as it was before. Before, maybe it was one of these like sage advice events where it was, let me tell you how to do things, versus now, I think it's important to help people synthesize through all the information that they're getting in, because there's too much input, if you will, at the moment.
Yeah, and you can almost have, decision paralysis where you have no idea what to do, and you maybe go a wrong direction. And we talk about that all the time, how valuable it would be to have someone who's influential in your life, is someone that you want to listen to, that can just steer you clear of the mistakes maybe they made, or just give you the knowledge that they wish they would have had at your age type thing.
Yep.
And it's hard because, you might have parents or someone in your life that can give that to you, but a lot of us, I'm speaking for myself here, didn't want to listen to parents when they were younger, saying, you're completely different from me. I would never do that or think that. And then looking back, you're like, oh yeah, sorry, you're right. But to have that at a pivotal time in your life when you're kind of dictating where your career is going to go. Yeah, I mean, I know we have a lot of important things that we want to talk about today, but that's maybe one that people should keep in their back pocket if they take anything away from this.
Yeah, no, I think it's critical, and I think having someone to sound ideas off of, right, and to be able to just ask the alternative question, or almost play devil's advocate to some extent in terms of a decision, allows you to walk away with more confidence that you're making that right decision, that you've thought through different scenarios. And I think that's so important when we're in such an information-rich environment these days.
Yeah, agreed. And so you've found mentorship, you followed what we can now see as sage advice. I'm sure at the time, who knows, but you followed good advice. You've found your career path. How did you get to, before we jump into really the project you're working on right now, how did you get to where you are? Because in terms of your position, your interest in this specific field, how did you narrow that down?
Yeah, so I think I mentioned earlier, so starting at MIT, I was kind of in a lab working on engineering organisms. And that was kind of an interesting time. It was a field, what's called metabolic engineering, that had been around for a little bit, not very long in the grand scheme of sciences. Our ability to engineer genetics was advanced at the time. It was immature compared to what it is now. So it was kind of really this interesting point where there were a good number of people working on it, but it wasn't a huge community. And I think there was a lot of opportunity for what biology could do, how we can use cells to produce new types of chemicals and fuels. So as some examples, some of the things I had worked on early on in my PhD, one of the major projects was engineering a bacteria, so engineering E. coli, and not the E. coli that gives us food poisoning, but there are many, many other types of E. coli that are good. Yes, not 0157, but there are a lot of other E. colis that are good. I like to say, E. coli is kind of like saying Homo sapien, and they're actually the vast majority are good and some are evil. And same type of thing with E. coli. There's a couple of evil ones, but there's a lot that are really actually pretty good for both for our digestion and for making various different pharmaceuticals and small molecule chemicals. So my work was actually engineering E. coli to produce lycopene. So it's a typical antioxidant that we have in tomatoes, and we were able to make a extraordinarily high contents of lycopene at the time, which for many, many years after that was the world's record for the most amount of lycopene that someone can produce in E. coli. And that kind of started people thinking about using industrial processes with microbes to produce these types of small molecules. Then kind of as through that time, I was working on different ways to do what we call synthetic biology. How do we rewire cells? And so that was kind of the end point there. I kind of did a little bit of a postdoc to look a little bit more at yeast type systems, so kind of getting away from bacteria and into more fungal systems, and then also into more mammalian cell systems, into working with therapeutic proteins. And then I started a position at UT Austin, and there wanted to go really in depth with what biology could do, the potential of harnessing the biochemistry that's in a cell. And we've created a number of different projects in terms of looking at creating sustainable oil production. So how do we actually make alternative oils that can be used either for fuel applications or for nutritional oils, things like omega-3 fatty acid type of oils and things of that nature. We've done a lot of projects in terms of making polymer precursors. So how can we make some of the major building blocks that we use to make our materials today? How can we make new nutraceuticals in a much more higher efficiency? How do we begin to bring together biology and material science to actually create living materials that can eventually, maybe in the future, can self-heal and respond to stimuli? Taking cells and being able to rewire them to do on-demand production of therapeutic proteins. So if we ever want to take a mission to Mars, it's going to take many years to go there. You're going to be able to need to make our pharmaceuticals on demand in case we need drugs. We have technologies for that. So really kind of thinking about these further reaching areas for what biology could do and finding ways to kind of solve those problems. And then more recently, that's taken us into this area of, well, what else can we use? How can we use biology to clean things up? How can we use biology to take all of our waste materials and convert those into other renewable chemicals and fuels or recircularizing kind of this carbon economy.
So I think quick recap for everyone listening. You took good advice. You fell in love with alchemy. You maybe were the inspiration behind Jurassic Park from your time at MIT. And now you're looking at, I mean, to, kind of heroize is not a word, but you're looking at how do we maybe save the world in small ways that can turn into big ways, which is kind of what you specialize in. How do you take a proven theory and turn it into practical application on a grand scale? So that kind of leads us to how we met originally about, I want to say 9 months ago, maybe even a year ago. Yeah, something like that. I read an article about a team of scientists and engineers at the University of Texas at Austin that found a way to, and I'm going to say this poorly, so you can correct me when I'm done, but undo or renew PET plastics, right? To break them down so they can be reused almost as a brand new material again. I mean, what does that mean? Summarize your project that you're working on right now for us.
Yeah, no, I think that was there was a great summary there. So really what we have been working on is, as I said, trying to take waste materials and convert them to something that's more reusable. And we've been working on that in both terrestrial type waste materials, but then more recently on plastic waste. And kind of the first project on that has been on PET. And PET is a pretty ubiquitous polymer. And we see that in various different types of food packaging, various different types of water bottles, various different types of even polyester fiber. So a lot of our clothing and fabrics and filler materials are PET plastics, and t-shirts and things like that. So we wanted to find a way in which we can actually break this apart, come back to the starting material, and then rebuild it back together. So first off, why would we even want to do that to begin with? We already have recycling processes, right? So why do we even need to do this? Well, recycling is not an infinite process. So we can't continuously recycle PET over and over again by traditional type of approaches, because as we go through this thermal melting and the reforming, we're actually causing failures in that plastic. So you can have issues where it's more brittle as time goes on. It's not going to have the same traits as you go through a virgin material versus a recycled material. Second issue is a lot of our plastic waste, especially in PET, is colored plastic, right? So it's really nice to have a fancy looking bottle or a fancy package that has a unique color associated with it. But the problem is when you start mixing all these things together, you're not going to get a nice clear plastic to start with that you can either add colorants to or have a clear plastic for a new bottle. So being able to break this material back down to its starting point and then rebuild it back up the same way that you would have made fresh material has an opportunity here to create a circularity point. So we were inspired by this because a couple of years ago, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, there's a group out in Japan that found there is a microorganism that can begin to grow on small parts of a water bottle. And so this is kind of fascinating that biology, in a very, very short period in time, if you think about it that way, has actually found a way to deal with some of the plastic waste that we put into the oceans and the waterways and the soil. Doesn't do an amazing job with it, but it's begun to see little glimmers of enzyme activity that can begin to break down this PET plastic. So then the scientists went through and found the enzyme associated with it. So a lot of our enzymes end in ACE as the name. So it's a PETase, so PET ACE, because it breaks down PET. And researchers have gone through and started thinking about how to improve this enzyme. So that's kind of where we jumped in. So together with our whole team, we've used what's called machine learning type of approaches to rationalize how we could engineer this enzyme to be much better. So as I said, in that native state, it wasn't that good of an enzyme. It did a little bit of a job, but it didn't break apart the whole piece of PET. It didn't do it quickly. It was a lab scale invention, right? Not the deployment that we would want at a much higher industrial scale. So now we were able to, through making mutations on this enzyme, be able to get it to occur much quicker in nature. We could actually take raw pieces of PET and completely break those down back to the building blocks in a matter of hours, going back to the original starting point, from which we can then repolymerize that back again and obtain virgin PET plastic with the exact same traits that the original plastic had. And moreover, we've been able to even take pieces of PET that had colorants in them, separate away the colorants, and then regenerate clear PET from that.
Oh, wow. Okay. So you can kind of solve two of the things that you talked about. You're closing the loop on this specific type of plastic, hypothetically. I know there's a lot more that goes into it than that, but in this scenario, you're closing the loop on it, but you're also getting it back completely to base format so that it can be made into green or blue or red or any other color we want again. Wow.
I mean, theoretically, then you can take a plastic bottle, right? Break that down, build it back up, and make it into the PET fibers that you would use for a clothing material. And at the end of that life, you should be able to take that, break that back down, back to the same starting materials, and then use that as a cupcake holder, right? And then the next time, be able to break that back down and repeat that process in any given way, because we really are thinking of this polymer as almost like beads on a chain, and you're just separating those beads apart and then re-putting them back together.
So it started with, not to go back to Jurassic Park again, but Jeff Goldblum, nature finds a way. It created this thing that you saw, and in your profession, your job is to take something that you know can happen on a small scale and turn it into something that is potentially viable on a large scale. So you've got this process down. You've made this, or you've created this ability to get us back really to square one and close the loop on a certain type of plastic. Obviously, we don't have facilities to process that yet, but what comes next in this process from your point of view?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is that discovery of that Jurassic Park style organism, right? So kind of like evolution finds a way. And I think that's really an important point, because evolution does find a way, has a way to create a lot of different starting points. And the more and more we mine different organisms, the more we start to see this diversity of enzyme function, from which we get unique starting points to find new function. And that's really in the essence of what we call this field of directed evolution. And this is really a good starting point for not just PET, but onward to other types of materials as well. And so there's a lot of research groups that after that discovery had started looking at trying to figure out what a scale up of this process would look like, trying to be able to go and create processes for that. And I think there's a lot of companies that are starting to look into this space, how we would scale this up, how you would produce these enzymes at a much larger scale, how you would collect and collate a lot of this plastic material, especially if it's coming in from different forms, different sources, any type of pre-treatments you would need to do for that. Not everything. In our lab, we have been using more pristine looking plastics. They're post-consumer plastics, but they're still not the stuff, not the muck that's on the bottom of your recycling bin that you would kind of scoop up out of there necessarily, right? So how do you deal with kind of these more real life kind of situations, if you will, and kind of then taking that, breaking that back down, building it back up, and then deploying that and distributing that. So I think it sits at a kind of a unique point in time where people are thinking about this as a genuine process, finding enzymes that can really work at scale and at the right temperature conditions, and seeing something that really has a drastic potential to change the way in which we think about plastic circularity.
And like in a hypothetical timeline, from where you are to where you envision this, say, I can take my PET water bottle and put it in my recycling bin, and it gets sent to a facility that utilizes your technology and breaks it down into new PET again. What is that timeline? Is this 5 years? Is this 50 years before it's maybe viable?
I think there's starting to be some proof of concept plants, let's say, that are starting to pop up across the world using other versions of an enzyme, right? Maybe not as efficient as the ones that we have. And this is kind of beginning to happen now. And so the full implementation, let's say, I think is on the years scale for sure now, right? In which case we can actually see these types of things popping up everywhere in a more efficient type of manner. And we begin to incorporate that into our overall recycling scheme. Right? And so I don't think it's as far off as complete science fiction there. And I think that's really promising to see that. And I think some of these early proof of concepts that people are doing are going to help think about the economics on the process, in which case we can begin, put the engineering hat back on again, right?
Mm-hmm.
Think about where the pinch points are in the process, what is left to be optimized, where the highest cost inputs are, so we can begin to think about how to optimize that. It may be a little bit more on the enzyme side, it may be more on the pre-treatment side, it may be more on the recovery of those building blocks for PET, but we need to begin to start seeing a model for this type of thing, because this doesn't exist already, right? This is not a process that already exists that we can start tweaking around. This is something that needs to be kind of invented piece by piece, and I think that's what is really exciting about this at the moment.
I mean, and it's interesting too, because when you speak of cost, everything in our world has a cost, and we spoke about this before. Whether it's single-use plastics or single-use compostables, or really, if you're washing something, everything has a cost associated with it. And it's interesting how this is, tackling one aspect of that, and how it might hopefully be able to snowball into, how do we make other things more sustainable in this vein? You're closing one loop, but there's so much more out there to tackle, to be aware of. And I know in our industry, it's a huge topic. Sustainability is a word that's thrown around a lot, but when you really boil it down, it's, how do you make it so that years from now, we're leaving this place a little better than when we got there? How are we making it so that it's going to be around for our kids?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think unfortunately, a lot of stuff comes down to the out of sight, out of mind type of thing. And people kind of like to think that because it says it's green or it's not what standard means, it's actually good, right? I think there's a lot of unsustainable food use. There's a lot of unsustainable kind of single-use materials that we believe are good. If you kind of look at some of the debates, there's a lot out there, right? Even just the comparison of a paper straw versus a plastic straw. Plastic straws have an end-of-life issue, but there's some studies that will say there's a higher water and energy content going into the production of the paper straw, right? So I think that the looking at things really globally, what we call this life cycle analysis and techno-economic analysis, really begins to open the door to the fact that there's a trade-off on everything. Everything that we make, every single item that we make, every single use thing that we make has a cost associated with it, has the amount of water that we use. There's a trade-off on using water for that versus using water to irrigate crops versus using water for our own household usage, right? Water is a scarce commodity these days, as we've seen even in certain cities. In Arizona recently had to shut the water off, right? So I think this is becoming an issue there. Land use is a huge issue. Choosing to use land to make a starting material for a packaging versus using that land for the production of food versus using that land to eventually live on, right? I think there's trade-offs on all these types of scopes. The looking at kind of the energy input, whether we use energy to make a certain thing or use energy to heat our homes or use energy to go into our electric car batteries, whatever the case may be, there's a trade-off in a lot of these types of things. And I think having even compostable materials, we need to think about those as single-use materials at the end of the day. Every time that we take a compostable material and put it into the compost bin, we may feel good because it disappears, if you will, much faster than it does with a piece of plastic that can last thousands of years. But at the same time, industrial composting is not the best process in the world. There's a lot of energy input for that, and all is lost at that point in time. The carbon that went into making that compostable material is then lost in the cycle. It's really an open cycle there. So I think that we have an opportunity, and the stuff that we're working on, continue to work on in our lab, an opportunity to take everything that's single use and thinking well beyond just plastic as a single use item, but everything else as a single use entity and converting that back into usable materials. So really everything we waste, everything we throw out has an opportunity to be broken back down and put back into the cycle.
I just thought of the title of this episode. It's Closing the Loop. I feel like it's just called Closing the Loop, because you're 100% right. No matter what it is, no matter what it looks like or what it feels like when you're using it, everything has a cost that has to be weighed against something else. And I wish it'd be really nice, especially in our world, if you could go out and say, this is the answer, this is what you do. But it's not. It's about weighing all those different variables and making the best decisions that you can. And 10 years from now, we might know very, very different things than we do today. And just
and have different technologies also at the end of the day to be able to deal with those types of things. I mean, I like to think that I like to say that we're taking biology and giving it a taste for waste, right? And I think that's part of what we need to do. Right. So maybe that's the other catchphrase, right? Closing the loop by having a taste for waste. but I think also on there, that's opening the door to new types of technologies. And like sometimes we don't know that we could do something else as an alternative, which is what has given us the set of decisions that we've made today. Tomorrow, we may have a very different outlook on what's possible. And then we have the ability to rethink how we're creating things and what that trade-off is at the end of the day for everything that we make and use.
And I think that's maybe the important takeaway. It's not about having all the answers today. It's about continuing to ask what's next and what's possible and how can we get better.
Yeah.
So, I mean, before I ask my closing question that I ask on every episode here that I will unveil in a moment, is there anything else that, we didn't cover that you're working on that, is just next? What is there something that you've moved on to? Are you still actively working on this? Where are you at?
Yeah, no, we're still working on PET plastic, trying to work on improving these enzymes, improving the process a little bit, trying to look at more of that practical application. So what happens when we have dirtier plastic waste at the end of the day, and how do we deal with those types of things? And then we're starting to delve into other materials, other types of plastic waste, and trying to find new solutions. It requires us to kind of go back to the beginning again. So dig into Jurassic Park again, find organisms that can actually begin to break down some of these other plastics. And there are organisms that can actually begin to slowly break down things from polyethylenes to polystyrenes, polypropylenes. So I think the pieces are there. We just have to begin to discover what those enzymes are, and then start using approaches to make those more efficient, and then build a process around it. So it's really, really an exciting time, I think, for this space.
Love it. I mean, I think we all wish you were done by Friday, wrap this up, make sure we can start using it, but it sounds like you
I do too, right? But science never moves that fast, which is unfortunate. But it keeps us engaged all the time. But
honestly, I will say, and I say this honestly, when I read the article initially, it was one of those moments that was kind of rekindled hope in a lot of ways. When you work in the industry that I do, and I work, I specialize in sustainability in most ways, it can be disheartening sometimes because you really peel back the layers and you get to see a lot of what things really are. And again, back to the cost of everything, and that there isn't just a right answer. But this is one of those things where, I only know what you've shared, but it just seems like, that's the right answer right there for that particular use case. It's just nice to see that maybe those do come from time to time.
Yeah, I mean, the other outcome that happened on this, which is kind of unexpected, I guess, to some extent, is we've got a lot of fan mail, I guess, if you will. So a lot of letters and notes from people, even from little kids, kind of interested in just plastic remediation and getting rid of plastics. And so what I think was awesome about that is that people were talking about science and biology. That's great.
Yeah.
Right? And the more that happens, the better. So I think that was just a wonderful outcome also to happen from the work.
Yeah. You and your team may have inspired a new generation of engineers and scientists to say, what comes next.
So maybe someone will, follow the unknowing path, if you will, of, somehow they'll look back and be like, when I wrote to that engineer, that's what got me thinking about being an engineer. So they'll be part of that flipped pencil, circle at some point in time.
Exactly. You must sleep like an absolute baby. You're like, I'm solving sustainability and eco crises, inspiring a generation.
Yeah.
It's only Tuesday.
Yeah.
But so I guess in that vein, where I always wrap up, because I just find it fascinating to see what people would do differently. If you had the opportunity to reach back through time, and maybe you do, if you had the ability to reach back through time and just have a quick conversation with yourself when this all started, when you started to go in the direction you are now, what would you say to yourself?
That's a great question. And so I've always had this question asked, and people are like, well, what would you do differently? Or what would you kind of give yourself advice? And so I'm not sure if it's a cop-out answer or it's an actual answer here, but I absolutely enjoy everything that I'm doing now. I think we are doing great things. We enjoy the science that we're doing. I enjoy where I am in terms of my path. And I wouldn't want to change that path, right? It's almost like Back to the Future, the movie series, right? If you make one little tweak somewhere or something, you may go off on an alternate 1985 and be in a completely different space than you thought you were, right? So a lot of that kind of those chance events and chance encounters really helped shape who I am and the path that I took of exploration. And I think really just stay engaged, stay interested, right? Is really the only advice. I wouldn't tweak it or push it in any different direction in some respect, because the outcome may be different at the end of the day. And that wouldn't be satisfying if it went the wrong direction.
So you simply ask for a crisp high five and go about your day.
Yeah.
I think pretty much everyone in the world would love to be able to look back at themselves and be like, yeah, no, nailed it. I got it. We're good. Wouldn't change a thing. So I don't think that's a cop out. I just think that, it's unique, but I think it's an incredible thing to be able to say. So, well, I really want to appreciate you jumping on today, sharing some of the, magic behind what you're doing. I know it takes an incredible amount of work and a brilliant team and a lot of dedication, but I think from our whole industry, just thank you for maybe solving one of the biggest problems that we have and giving us a little bit of hope into what comes next.
Yeah, no, thanks again for having me. And I'm very happy to be able to be here today to represent all the work that our team has done. So hopefully it has inspired people to kind of think about this and connect with us for opportunities in the time to come.
Well, if you're ever on Time Magazine, you have to come back and do a second episode just to let us know how that
All
goes.
right, sold. That is a deal.
All right. I appreciate you so much. And I think that's it for today's episode of Served by SHFM. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for tuning in to today's episode of Served by SHFM, your food service hospitality podcast. Please keep in mind that the views and opinions expressed on today's episode are not necessarily those of SHFM or any of its members.